Today we're going to be talking about Unit 3 of Social Psychology, which means we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, themselves. So this week we're going to be focusing on the self, including the self concept. So what do we know about the self and how do we get one? So let's move into it. So the chapter is called The Self in the Social World. What we'll realize is that our self-concepts come from social interactions, and that's why it's all social. All of our learning outcomes are here, and all of these can be found in the module as well. I suggest that you read them over before you start the unit so that you know what to expect, what's coming, and then also read them over once you're done with the reading and learnings for the unit to see if there's any of them that maybe you don't feel as comfortable with and you need to revisit, okay? So many times as humans, especially if we're talking about individualistic humans, humans who come from a culture where the focus is on the individual, as opposed to a collectivistic culture where the focus is on the group, individualistic humans tend to think that the focus is on themselves. So they go out in public and they think that everyone's staring at them, when in fact, if everyone's focus is on themselves, then they're really not thinking about you, they're thinking more about themselves, right? So we've got a whole country of people walking around thinking about how they look as opposed to looking at how you look. So we have this thought, though, that everyone is staring at us. So, for example, we have a pimple on our face and we see it obviously because we look in the mirror and we see it and we think everyone else is going to think about it or recognize it, comment on it, or they're thinking about like, oh, wow, Liz has this huge zit on her face. When in fact, their focus is on the coffee that they spilled on themselves this morning and thinking about how everyone's going to think about that. So the spotlight effect is this idea that we as individualistic humans have, that everyone's staring at us, everyone's watching us. And the research shows that really this is not the case. Again, everyone's focused on themselves as opposed to focusing on you. And one of the ways that we can use this is to remember this when we're doing, let's say, a speech. So if you're taking a speech class and you think to yourself like, oh, everyone's going to be staring at me, they're going to recognize when I stumble over my words, things like that. Keep in mind, the students that haven't done their presentation yet are more focused on how they're going to do their presentation. And the students who have already done their presentation are probably still reeling from doing their presentation. So they're not so much focused on you, they're again focused on themselves, right? So we do experience the spotlight effect, but you can use what you learn in this class to remember they're not thinking about what I'm doing or what I look like or things like that. I've had students say, you know, I wore the same clothes to class 3 days in a row and nobody noticed. Well, yeah, because people aren't going to notice maybe until you start to smell. Another thing we want to keep in mind is that as humans, we tend to think that any emotions we're experiencing up here, anything that's stressing us out, anything that's bothering us, that we are transparent. And so we have this thought that everyone should be capable of recognizing that I am angry and they should know to leave me alone. And this is not the case. We are not transparent. So we experience the illusion of transparency in that we perceive that if I'm sad, everyone can see it. If I'm upset, everyone can see it. When in fact, as I said, this is not the case. Most of the time, they're focusing on themselves as opposed to on you. And so think about this in terms of an application. If you're in a relationship with someone, many times we expect that that other person is going to recognize when we're frustrated, recognize when we're angry, because we feel that we are transparent, especially because we think that this other person who supposedly knows us so well should know. We are not transparent. So if you are frustrated with your significant other, you need to verbalize that and let them know why. Because again, their focus is on themselves and not on you. and you are not transparent. And thus, we do have to have a conversation where we can let other people know. If we think that maybe someone else is having a rough day, and we want to kind of check that with them, then we can say, hey, it seems like you're having a frustrating day. What's going on? So to get them to talk about what their experience is. So to find out, are they angry with you, or are they just frustrated with traffic or overwhelmed with their classes, things like that. So everyone's not watching you, and you are not transparent. Those are the two things that we need to know from this slide. So let's talk about the self-concept. So we a lot of times we say, myself, or my understanding of myself, and what we're really referring to is our self-concept. It's what we know about self. It's what we believe about ourselves. So this is the cognitive or thinking portion of the self. So if I believe that I am good at something, that's part of my self-concept. Also, if I believe that I'm bad at something, then that's part of my self-concept. We also have what we call self-schemas. These are beliefs that organize or guide the processing of self-relevant information. Think of any sort of schema like a file folder in the brain. And so you have a file folder in your brain of information that relates to the self. For example, your name is part of your self-schema, part of that file folder. And so whenever you're out in public and someone says your name, especially if your name is something that not many people have, then your brain automatically orients towards that. I'm gonna just say my name because of the self-schema. All right, so the self-schema is going to organize information about the self. So like I said, a file folder. And then also it's going to guide our processing of information. And so let's say that, part of my self-schema is that I am a knitter. And so if I'm out in public and brain hears the word knitting, it automatically, like, oh, people are talking about my knitting. What's going on? Okay, so that's what goes into the self-schema, is those terms or those things that relate to the self-concept that guide the processing of information. You've also probably over your lifetime heard a lot about this idea of self-esteem. Self-esteem is our overall self-evaluation. This is the emotional component of the self-concept, and it's how we feel about the self. Okay, so we can actually talk about two different types of self-esteem. We can talk about trait self-esteem, which is overall, day in, day out, how do I feel about myself on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the best. Whereas state self-esteem is how do I feel about myself right now in this moment. So you may have a pretty high trait self-esteem. Overall, you think pretty well of yourself. So you're at a 7 or an 8 for your trait self-esteem. Then you get an exam score back and you get a 30, and you studied a lot and you're really frustrated and you feel badly about yourself for a bit, and that may decrease your state self-esteem. How do you feel right now? Your current state of mind. Okay. Now, state self-esteem, if it continues to happen, can impact your trait self-esteem. But typically, let's say that I just have a bad day, it's not going to influence my overall trait self-esteem. It's not going to bring my 7 down to a 6 or a 5 just because I had one bad day. All right. Self-esteem is rather challenging to assess. Many times there's a typical self-esteem scale out there, and it's everyone knows that you're supposed to think well about yourself. And so the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, which is very few questions on a Likert scale of 1 to 7, it's pretty easy to, I guess you could say, beat. So it's really challenging to use as a research instrument, simply because the results of it may not be too accurate, because in order to protect their self-concept or how they think about themselves, people may score themselves more highly than they actually think of themselves, because they recognize pretty easily that this short questionnaire is about their self-esteem. Now, part of our self-esteem relates to what we perceive as the locus of control, or where does the control of my life come from. And so if we perceive that things happen to us, everything happens to me, my life is horrible because all these bad things happen to me, that indicates that the person has an external locus of control, external meaning outside of the self. Whereas if the person says that they are capable of making positive change to their lives, that they will study harder for the next exam, that indicates an internal locus of control. So many times self-esteem and locus of control are related. If the person has an internal locus of control, they typically have a higher self-esteem because they recognize that while they may not have done the best today, they can work to do better tomorrow. Whereas if I have an external locus of control, I perceive that things happen to me, then typically I have a lower sense of self-esteem because there's nothing that I can do about all this crap that happens to me all the time. So I feel badly about my self-esteem. So I feel badly about the self. We also see that humans experience, part of the self-concept is going to be self-efficacies, or things that we feel that we are competent at. So many times in my face-to-face classes, I'll ask students, okay, so what are you good at? And I'll get things like, cooking, baking, riding a bike, writing. These are all things that we are competent at. So part of your self-concept is going to be the things that you recognize that you are good at. We also sometimes experience what we call learned helplessness. This is the idea that through negative experiences, we can learn that trying is futile, that no matter what I do, and this also relates to what we were talking about in terms of the external locus of control, no matter what I do, nothing works. Some related research to learned helplessness studied dogs and dog behavior. Some of the dogs, that was an experiment, we had different levels or different things that were done to different groups of dogs. So the control group of dogs was left in their crate, so in a wire cage, whereas one of the experimental groups of dogs had parts of the floor of the cage that were potentially electrified. And so the researchers could turn them on, and the dog would step on the part that was electrified and would recognize that, my paws are getting burned here, and it would move away. And then in the third group, the whole cage became electrified. So no matter where the dog tried to go, it couldn't escape this electrical stimulation on its paws. So what the researchers found is that if the dog spent too much time in the fully electrified cage, eventually they would stop trying to find a spot that wasn't electrified because they couldn't find one, and they would just sit down and they would take it. That's what learned helplessness is. When the person gets to the point where they just lay down and take it because they've tried at what they perceive to be everything, and they can't figure out a way to get away from this electrified cage. I've talked to a lot of students who say, oh, that sounds like my sibling, or that sounds like my boyfriend. How do I help this person? And so the question is, you think about it. You've got this dog who's learned that no matter what they do, they're going to get electrocuted. How do you teach them? How do you help them to recognize that they're not going to get electrocuted? Many times this is extremely challenging, even for a therapist, never mind for a person who's just beginning their training in psychology. So my suggestion is always to say, what, this isn't something that you as an individual can completely help the person to deal with. So definitely suggesting counseling, but also remaining consistent and positive with the person, which is going to take a lot of your personal positive energy and may or may not be effective. It may or may not work. So those are things to keep in mind if you experience someone who has learned helplessness. Another part of the self-concept is going to be Possible selves. These are things that we either dream about. So my possible self is going to be a therapist with a master's degree with my own private practice, or it could be something that I'm trying to avoid. So a possible self that I don't want to become. I don't want to become like my, if you perceive that you had a dad that was a negative person or negative influence in your life, then you want to avoid becoming that person. Okay. So in terms of possible selves, these can be things that we dream about becoming or that we dread becoming and that we're working to not become. Where do we get a self-concept from? Multiple locations or multiple things are going to influence the development of the self-concept. First one, and these are in no particular order, so this, culture isn't the most important. So the first one is going to be our culture. Remember, we talked about culture in Unit 1. This is going to be the information that we learn from our group about how to behave, what to think. It's also going to be the language and traditions of our group. So we've talked before in this video about individualism versus collectivism. So if you come from an individualistic culture, that's going to teach you that the focus is going to be on the individual, on the self. Whereas if you come from a collectivistic culture, that's going to teach you that the focus should be on the larger group before the self. So our culture can also teach us things about our sex. So, for example, some cultures denigrate female and, raise up the importance of being male. And so if that's your culture, then part of your self-concept, how you feel about yourself, may come from your sex and your culture and how those two interact. I've talked to a lot of folks who talk about colorism, meaning that the color of your skin impacts how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. So if you identify yourself as Black, but you are lighter skinned than other people in your family, then you may experience negative vibes from your family members because of the fact that your skin is a different tone than your family members or from your group members. So a culture may teach us things about ourselves based upon what that culture values and what that culture doesn't value. And if something that you personally have is something that that culture doesn't value, then typically you're going to receive punishment or negative things from your culture about the self-concept because the fact that you identify with something that the culture doesn't like. Another example, or another place that the self-concept comes from is from our experiences. So if we have teachers who tell us, wow, if you work really hard, you're good at math, then that can influence how we think about the self in terms of our self-concept. Whereas if we have teachers who do the opposite and say like, wow, no matter how hard you try, you still suck at math, then that's going to influence our self-concept as well. So experiences that we have with other people, with other children, with teachers, with parents, with peers, with significant others early in adolescence, all of those experiences can tell us things about the self that we then kind of build into that self-concept and become part of our self-schema. We've already talked a little bit about this idea of reinforcement and punishment. So let's say that as a child, you tried to be funny and you tried to tell jokes and your family members said, you're not funny. Then this would be experienced as a punishment. Punishment typically decreases the behavior. And so we may then start thinking in terms of the self-concept that no matter what I try, I'm not funny, so don't try to be funny. Whereas if we as children put on shows for our families with, dancing and singing, and our families laughed and clapped and said we did a great job, then this reinforces that behavior, which tends to increase the behavior, which may then become part of the self-concept. I'm good at dancing. I'm good at entertaining people. Obviously, we can also see these reinforcements and punishments in a school setting as well, in a peer setting. So when your peers say to you, like, you're not pretty, okay, or, you're ugly, things like that, that would be considered a punishment. And that may become part of how we think about the self, part of the self concept, which can then influence self-esteem and all that stuff. We can also think about our self-concept comes from our models. We're not talking about, the folks walking down the runway wearing nice clothes. We're talking about the people around us that we look up to, that tell us, what's going on in the world. And so if our models for behavior show us or tell us that we are a good person, that we, are doing a good job, then this becomes part of our self-concept. Whereas if our models tell us, you need to avoid doing this and avoid doing that, then we may start to think of ourselves as, someone who behaves in ways to avoid things as opposed to moving towards things. So the models that we have in our lives are going to influence what we know about the self, what we think about the self. Many times when I talk to clients and they say, oh, well, I'm really bad at this. And I say, okay, in your brain, when brain says you're really bad at math, whose voice is it that says you're really bad at math? Is it your voice or is it someone else's voice? And many times they'll say, oh, well, no, it's my mom's voice. Or no, it's my elementary school math teacher's voice. So the models that we have as children are highly influential in terms of the development of the self-concept. And so if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a daycare provider, you need to think about that. We need to think about how we interact with the children in our lives, because we are actively building this child's self-concept with them. We don't want to overinflate it. We don't want to tell them like, wow, you're amazing at everything, because then eventually they're going to realize that you were lying, because there's a couple things that they realize they're not amazing at, right? So we want to be accurate, and the focus should really be more about what we are capable of doing rather than overall saying like, you're smart. So you're smart indicates that you can do things without trying. Whereas if we say things like, you worked really hard on that and it came out really well, that indicates hard work comes out well. Okay. So, and then this also relates to what we're talking about here, is what other people say about us. So if other people are saying things such as, when you work really hard, the outcome is good, then that becomes part of the self-concept. Whereas if we say like, wow, you're stupid, stupid kind of means like no change is possible, you're stuck. So if we tell people that, then really what we're doing is, creating this self-concept of no matter what I try, I'm still going to be stupid. So moving back to that idea of learned helplessness that we already talked about. Now, we also, once we've developed some of our self-concepts, we have an idea of kind of who we are. If we go out in the world and other people agree with that, then that reinforces it, and our idea of ourselves will continue. Whereas if we go out into the world and we say, I'm really good at math, and then someone says to us like, no, actually you're not. So if people disagree with it, then it makes us question our self-concept. Now, as children, it will make us question our self-concept. If we're an adult and another adult says to us, what you just said about your self-concept is incorrect, this will actually cause what we call psychological reactance. It's usually where something that threatens the self-concept comes up. And so rather than change the self-concept, most humans will kind of get angry with you as opposed to stop and think like, wow, maybe I'm not as good at math as I thought. And so they're now going to try to prove you wrong. So it's like the horns come up and you're like, excuse me? No, I am good at math. You are wrong. And here's how I'm going to show you that. Okay. So if others agree with what we say about the self in childhood, then it's going to reinforce it. Whereas if we're an adult and others disagree with us, especially because we've had that self-concept for so long, then rather than challenge the self-concept, we're going to challenge the person that said it. So let's think a little bit about our own personal self-concept. We can do this through what we call the 20 statements test. So the 20 statements test involves getting on a piece of paper and writing down I am 20 times, and then finishing that statement. So I am a mother. I am Liz. I am female. And you can also update it a little bit. I am a knitter. I am a student. You can change it. You can, use some different verbs, things like that. So what you want to do is pause the video and do this. Write down 20 I am statements. I'll be here waiting. Okay, so you finished. Now we're going to talk about what does this do? What does the 20 statements test do? So it's going to access our self-concept, the things that we know about the self. It's going to look at our self-efficacies. What do we think we're good at? Maybe what do we think we're not so good at? Some people might have written things such as, I am not a good writer, okay? It's going to look at possible selves. I am going to be a pop star, say 3 of my Animal Crossing characters on my island. It can also say I'm not going to be a bad father. That would be another possible self. It's going to access social comparison. So social comparison means that I sit down and I look at how other people are and I compare myself to them. So if I'm a knitter and my best friend Katie is also a knitter, I'm going to compare myself to her in terms of our knitting abilities. I will automatically recognize, because I am very humble about this, that she's way better than I am. And if I have a problem, usually I go to her. So this social comparison puts me here and puts my best friend here. So I am looking up at this person. So this is what we call an upward social comparison. If I do an upward social comparison, I've got 2 options. Either I can think to myself, Katie's better than me, I should ask her for help, or Katie's better than me, I suck. So using upward social comparisons either motivates us to do better or makes us feel bad about ourselves. Now, a downward social comparison is where we look at another person who's less off than we are. Maybe they have less money than we do. We have a better car than they do. And we compare ourselves to that person or to that event. And we think, well, at least, I have a better car than they do. That's what we call a downward social comparison. Downward social comparisons typically make us feel better about ourselves. So 20 statements test is definitely going to access social comparison. So thinking to ourselves, I'm better at spelling than my brother, so I should put I am good at spelling on my 20 statements test. So the 20 statements test may be influenced by how we present ourselves and want to be seen by other people. So self-presentation is the idea that we choose how we want to be seen by other people, and then we put on that costume, we put on that face, we put on that hairstyle, and we try to get people to think that we are a certain way by how we present ourselves. So think about, my dad always said, dress for the job that you want. That's self-presentation. You are presenting yourself to these other people, to the interviewers, as a person who fits in working in this environment. It may be influenced by what we call self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is where we look around and go, okay, so everyone else seems to be behaving in this way, so I should behave in this way as well. Do I fit in? If not, let me adjust my behaviors so that I fit in. Okay, so I'm monitoring what I'm doing and how I'm being perceived, and if it's not what I want, then I'm going to try to fix it or rearrange it. And then obviously the 20 statements test is going to access our attitudes. Attitudes are going to be positive or negative evaluations of a noun, a person, a place, or a thing. So I like pizza. That's a positive attitude towards pizza. We can also talk about 2 different types of attitudes. An implicit attitude is an attitude that we may not recognize that we have. It's not something that we can pull out of the brain and say, I like pizza. It's more kind of subconscious or even unconscious. So it's not really recognizable to the conscious mind. So many times people will say, like, I'm not racist. And the thing is, but they behave in ways that indicate that they are racist. So they may have racist implicit attitudes, but those implicit attitudes are buried so far back in their brain that they can't pull them out. They can't make them explicit. Explicit attitudes are the ones that we can verbalize. So on the 20 statements test, we would be verbalizing explicit attitudes because we don't really, unless we're kind of provoked to, we don't have access to our implicit attitudes. Another thing that this unit looks at is our cognitions regarding social situation. Remember, cognitions are thoughts. So let's talk a lot. And social cognition is a really big research area within social psychology now, and it has been since about the 1960s. So a couple of the social cognitions that we want to remember from this unit include the self-reference effect. We will remember things better if something fits me. So for example, if we access that self-schema and it's got that file folder that's got all the information about us in there, right? And if we can take something new and apply it to our self-schema, then we will remember it better. So for example, if your name is Stuart and you meet another person named Stuart, because it fits with you, you'll be better able to remember that other person's name. That's the self-reference effect. Because I reference the self-concept and reference the self-schema, I am better able to remember it. Okay, so I remember what fits me because of the fact that it fits in with what I know about myself. You may have had teachers over the years tell you one of the best ways to learn and remember things is to apply it to things that you already know. And that's an example of the self-reference effect. We talked already about this, so apparently I got ahead of myself. Social comparison, again, is where we evaluate our opinions and abilities by comparing them with other people's opinions and abilities. Upward social comparisons, remember, I'm here, Katie's here, and it can either cause me to be more motivated to be better at knitting, or it can make me feel bad about myself. Downward social comparisons, where I compare myself to my neighbor whose car is not working and my car is working. I think, well, at least I don't have a broken down car in my driveway. Okay. Self-serving bias is where we perceive ourselves favorably, unfortunately, to the detriment of other people. So we're going to, things that are related to ourself and our self-concept, we're going to perceive them favorably, because if I perceive things to the self-concept negatively, that would mean that I'm a bad person. And that's just not possible, because then I'd feel bad about myself. So everything about the self and the self-concept is good. And if it doesn't fit with the self-concept, then either it's not good or I have to evaluate it on an individual basis. So everything that's related to the self is positive. That is the self-serving bias. We also have what we call self-serving attributions. This means that I attribute everything that comes from me, and then if it doesn't come from me, so let's say that I'm working on a group project and the group got a really good grade on the project. Well, obviously that's because of my individual contribution, right? Now, I'm working on a group project and the group project gets a 0. That's obviously all y'all's fault. There's nothing to do with me because I did what I was supposed to do. I don't know what y'all did. Okay, so self-serving attributions are where if there's a positive outcome, that was mine. And if there's a negative outcome, that was all y'all. We can also talk about the idea of self-control. Lots of these self-concepts, right? One thing to keep in mind, they all have a hyphen. So if you're not typing a hyphen between self-serving bias or self-serving attributions or self-control or self-concept or self-esteem, then your editing program should pick it up and say like, hey, there should be a hyphen here. So self-control is being able to cognitively control our behavior. Okay, so think of it as your frontal lobe, which is the part of the brain that controls self-control, also forward thinking, things like that. If you have, if your self-control is good, then brain can say like, this is a bad idea, don't do that. Small children typically have really poor self-control because it is not, the frontal lobe is not well developed. People who are tired, people who are hangry, people who are dehydrated have poor self-control because brain is not getting all the stuff that it needs in order to do good self-control. And so a lot of times we will see that people will maybe make comments that they shouldn't, or that they wouldn't have normally if they're tired or they're dehydrated, things like that. Also, if people are overstimulated, then they may have poor self-control as well. So there's lots of different influences on our ability to maintain our self-control, but like I said, sleep, water, food, all of those things that you need to be a well-functioning human are necessary for us to have self-control. We can also, as humans, talk more about the idea of what we call the planning fallacy. So you've probably experienced this. You may have experienced this within the past couple of weeks within our class just starting. The planning fallacy is this incorrect idea that we have that I know exactly how long something will take me to complete and that I have the time to do it. So many times students will say, oh, you know, it'll take me like a half an hour to read the chapter. Like the chapter is 30 pages long. It has at least 400 words per page. Even if you read super fast, you're not going to get through it in 30 minutes. But if you read super fast, you're not going to understand any of it. So we are poor at projecting how long it's going to take us to do something. So you may have experienced that with, you know, assignments for this class already, where you said, oh, it's only going to take me like 5 minutes to do that. And 4 hours later, you're still working on it. Okay. So don't feel bad about the fact that you're not good at this, at that planning bit, because most of us are not. The important thing is that we, as social psychologists, recognize this planning fallacy and we plan because of it. So we say, okay, you know, I think it's going to take me 30 minutes to read the chapter. Let's multiply that time, you know, at least 2, so that I can give myself enough time to actually get it done. We also, as humans, experience what is called the impact bias. We believe that things that happen to us are going to be way more long-term influential than they actually are. This thing's going to impact me for so long. So think about adolescent breakups. Oh my God, I'm never gonna love again. My life is horrible. That would be the impact bias. Thinking like, this is going to last forever and I'm going to be sad forever, when in fact, you know, 6 weeks later, yeah, you're still a little bit sad, but obviously it wasn't forever, okay? As humans, we also experience immune neglect. So it's where we underestimate how quickly our psychological immune system recovers from stuff. So let's say that we do break up and we think, oh, I'm never going to get over this person, and then we feel better within a couple of weeks. That is what we call immune neglect. Okay, so impact bias example would be, you know, I just met this person and we're going to get married and we're going to love each other forever. And then immune neglect is, we broke up and now I'm never going to ever love someone ever again. So we have a psychological immune system and we are bad at predicting how long it's going to take us to bounce back from negative things that happen to us. That's immune neglect. So take a break, because I know I've been talking for a long time. Think about one of the social cognitions we just studied and come up with an example of it. I'll wait. So write it down in your notebook. And again, we talked about this, the more it applies to you and your self-concept and your self-schema, the better able you'll be to remember it. Talk about, what about the self and groups and how does that work? many times you're in a group of friends and someone says, we should go to Chick-fil-A to get lunch. And nobody else says anything. And so you as the individual are sitting around going, well, nobody else is saying anything. So they must all agree with that other person. It's what we call the false consensus effect. And it's not true. There's probably somebody out there that wants to go like, I don't like their chicken or something like that. But because nobody else is saying anything, we feel the need to conform to the group norm of nobody saying anything. But as an individual who's thinking about disagreeing, we realize nobody else is disagreeing. So we think, oh, they must agree. Okay. So whenever you hear someone say, well, everyone knows that this is what we call the false consensus effect. They haven't run into anybody that disagrees with them, probably because all of their media that they consume already agrees with them. So that's what is the false consensus effect, where we think incorrectly that everyone agrees with us, because obviously I am always right, right? Now, we also experience the false uniqueness effect. This is where we as individuals think that we're special little snowflakes. And maybe because of our experiences, maybe because of our abilities, maybe because of combined our experiences and our abilities, when in fact humans are more similar than they are different. We underestimate how common our good behaviors are. And then so let's say that you're starting talking to a whole new group of people and you say like, oh, well, I was first chair in band in my high school. And 4 other people in your new group of friends may be like, I was too. And you're like, well, that's not possible because I'm important. So we falsely believe that the stuff that is part of our self-concept and part of our story of ourselves is that much different and that much more important than the experiences that other people have had, when in fact, many of the experiences that we have had, other people have had them too. So that's what we call the false uniqueness effect. It's the belief that, I'm so different from other people. And then, other people start saying like, oh no, I had that experience too. And brain is like, nope, I'm the most important person in the world right here. So obviously my experience was much better or more important than yours was. I don't suggest saying that out loud, though. It doesn't test well. We also experience not just a self-serving bias, so everything I do, thumbs up, but we also experience a group-serving bias. So if we have a group of close friends, then we're going to think that the people in our in-group, the groups that we are part of, that's our in-group, right? Our in-group, thumbs up. Anybody in the out-group, groups I'm not a part of, thumbs down, okay? So I like my in-group because I'm part of it, duh. And I'm not similar to the out-group, at least I don't think so, when in fact, I'm probably more like my out-group than I know, but we won't get into that in this chapter. But you can see how this might create, friction between groups. And we'll talk about conflict between groups in a couple of weeks from now. So this group serving bias is this, first of all, I like me, I'm part of this group, that I like me extends out to my group members, but it does not extend out past the boundaries of our group, and thus it does not extend out to the out group. So if you think about, look at this diagram over here. So here's the universe, here's me, people who are similar to me, people who are in my out group, stuff about me, my stuff I hate, all important. Here's other people. And then there's nowhere. That's pretty much our focus. We can also talk about social behaviors, things that we do in social situations in order to protect the self-concept that we've already built. One thing that we do is self-handicapping. And so let's say that we expect we're not going to do so well on a test tomorrow. Rather than sit down and study all night, we're just going to not. And that way, we will end up getting the grade that we expect. And then, yeah, it will just come true. Okay. So I remember being in college my first semester freshman year, and I was 17 Most of my peers were 18. And I remember one Thursday night, and I don't know why, but like when you live on campus, there's this like going out on Thursday night thing. And I'm like, we had class on Friday. NVC doesn't have classes on Friday, but we had classes on Friday. And if you're a freshman, you get stuck with 8 a.m. Friday classes because you registered after everybody else. And so I remember I was studying for a history test Friday morning, Thursday night, and one of my friends comes in, he's in my class, and he's like, hey, we're gonna go drink and you want to come? And I was just like, no, we have a test tomorrow, like we should sit down and study for the test. And he was just like, I'm gonna fail that test. He's like, I may as well just get drunk and then I can be like, oh, I failed the test because I was hungover. So this is self-handicapping. I create an excuse before it happens so that I can protect the self-concept when something bad does happen. We already talked about this, self-presentation. So how we create a favorable impression. So when I always used to laugh when we would go to, parties and things like that in college, because I honestly didn't care about self-presentation. I didn't care about what the folks that I was interacting with thought of me. Maybe that's because I have autism. Maybe it's for other multiple reasons. Who knows? Anyway, so I would wear like jeans and a t-shirt and some sneakers. I don't care. And people are like, well, aren't you going to do your makeup? Aren't you going to do your hair? I'm like, why? What's the point? And so many of these folks were putting on like their best clothes to go to a frat party at this frat house that probably hadn't been cleaned in like 6 years and was absolutely disgusting and smelled like beer and urine. I'm like, why? So they were focused on self-presentation, on creating a favorable impression to other people for whatever reason, whereas I wasn't as focused on self-presentation at that point. Now, if you ask me, did you go out and buy new clothes for your first interview for your first ever teaching job? I totally did. And I focused on my self-presentation for that to make sure that I was perceived as the best candidate for the job. Okay. So self-presentation is choosing to put your, I fit here face forward so that you can impress other people. We already talked about self-monitoring as well. So when we are attuned to how we present ourselves, we adjust to create the desired impression. So we kind of look around and go like, okay, I am, giving off the vibe that I want to, so I'm going to continue doing this. Or I am not giving off the vibe that I want to. I need to, so that's the monitoring part, right? So I need to change my behavior so that I can hopefully give off the vibe that I want to. And then we monitor again, like, okay, did that work out? We also want to define attitudes for this unit, which is something that we'll talk more about next week. Attitude, the technical definition of which, we already talked about this, is a positive or negative evaluation of something or someone. So I like pizza, I prefer dogs to cats. These are all attitudes. You may, whenever you hear the word attitude, you may think back to when you were an adolescent and someone said to you, don't give me that attitude. I think what they were referring to is it seems that you have a negative evaluation of me, so let's not do that. But we do want to remember the operational definition of attitude for the social sciences is going to be a positive or negative evaluation of something or someone. Now, we can have, as humans, a dual attitude system, which means that we can have different attitudes towards the same object and maybe not recognize that we have two different attitudes. So again, the implicit attitude is going to be that one that we don't really recognize, whereas the explicit attitude is the one that we can verbalize, that we can tell people about. And then the question becomes, okay, can we change these? So if I've got, a family member who's like super racist with a capital S, can I help them change? Is it, even useful for me to sit and try to work with this person and try to help them become less racist? Usually implicit attitudes are going to change slowly with practice and with experience. So it's going to take some time to change implicit attitudes. We need to, on purpose, learn new things relating to that attitude to make positive change. So this is really something that the person has to want to do. They have to recognize that they have this poor implicit attitude, and then they have to be interested in changing it and work on that change themselves. Whereas explicit attitudes are easier to change. We can change them with education. We may be able to change them with persuasive techniques, which we'll learn about in another unit. But remember, explicit attitudes are the ones that people can recognize, they can pull out of their brain, they can verbalize, they can easily tell you, I don't like this political person because of XYZ. We can more easily change those attitudes than we can attitudes that people don't recognize that they have, which are those implicit attitudes. Okay, so that is kind of a overview of our unit 3 for this week. It is not everything, obviously, related to the self-concept, because there's like whole textbooks on the self-concept. I've actually taken 3 whole semester classes about the self-concept, so there's way more out there than what we can study in this 1 week. But those are the concepts that I really want you to take away from with this semester. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, or you can send me a message in Canvas and we can chat about it. Thanks.